Bonigut, who's our family services manager, and one of my great colleagues at the Alzheimer's Association. And together, we're going to take you through some of our great opportunities today to learn. We're going to identify those reasons why we need to take care of ourselves as we age. We all know we have to do it, but hopefully today you'll get some easy tips and tricks and really get that motivation from learning about those strategies, hearing about the science, and how you can then move forward with a plan. And why we do this, why Stefanie and I do our job, and why this mission is so important to us. Well, the facts are overwhelming and pretty sobering when you think about more than 6 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease today. The cost of care for Alzheimer's and other dementias this year will be over $355 billion. We know that 1 in 3 seniors die with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. And we did see an increase this year in deaths because of the COVID, related to the COVID-19 pandemic, not necessarily because of COVID. And we'll talk about a little bit of the science behind what we've learned about COVID and the brain. And so I put this slide up here to say, this is why we need to find the hope. And this is why we need to get you motivated about why taking care of our brain is as important as taking care of every other part of our body. So with that, I'm going to switch to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Stefanie to take us on the first part of our journey.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you all for joining us. And I was chuckling to myself seeing your events calendar with all these activities that are going to fit in so well with what we're going to talk about. But as Claire said, we're all aging, and we hopefully are going to be aging as well as we can. And aging actually depends on a number of factors. It can depend on our genes. And we don't have a lot of control over our genes. Some of us couldn't help that our hair turned gray in our 30s. Aging also depends on our environment. An example of that for myself is I live in San Francisco. You heard me say that. And I used to live in an area called Dogpatch near 280. And I love having my windows open, but being a block away from 280, I have to dust my house every day because of all the freeway dust. Luckily, I was able to move, and now I live over by the Golden Gate Bridge and the Presidio and Land's End, and it's much cleaner air. But I was lucky. I was able to change my environment and move to a slightly healthier place. So we don't always have total control over our environment. Aging also depends on our lifestyle, and these are the choices that we can make on a day-to-day basis, whether we want to live a little healthier lifestyle, excuse me, or not. So these are what we're going to talk about a lot today, is these lifestyle changes and choices we can make. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the brain. The brain is an organ. It's up in our head. It controls everything in our body. It's also a little bit like a muscle, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But our brain is made up of neurons, nerve cells, and there's 100 billion of them. And those neurons make pathways within our brain and throughout our body. And that's how the brain controls things. So there's a pathway of neurons that goes from my head to the tip of my finger that lets me move my finger. There's a pathway of neurons that goes from my brain to my mouth so I can be speaking these words to you. There's pathways within my brain of neurons that are memories and thoughts. And so that is how our brain really controls everything in our body. And Alzheimer's disease destroys these brain cells. And we don't exactly know the full biology behind it. We just know that it's a neurodegenerative brain disease that kills these neurons. Next slide, please. What we do know in our field, we always say what's good for your heart is good for your brain. So we know the things that we've heard about for actually a long time about cardiovascular health and what's good for your heart. We also know really helps our brain. So our brain is this little 3-pound-ish organ in our head. It's about the size and shape of a cauliflower. And it gets 25% of every heartbeat's blood. So when you think about that 3-pound organ and the rest of your body, how much the rest of your body weighs, your brain is getting a ton of blood. And that blood with every heartbeat is bringing oxygen, it's bringing nutrients to our brain, it's taking away waste products. So it's really helping to keep our brain healthy. So obviously, if our heart is healthy and functioning well, that's going to help our brain. Next slide, please. So a little bit about dementia and Alzheimer's, because I know even in my own work as a social worker, I use the words interchangeably, but dementia and Alzheimer's are slightly different. Dementia is the umbrella term. Dementia is a set of symptoms that cause cognitive, or that are talked about as cognitive decline. And so we can see changes in people's thinking, their mood, their behaviors, what we call executive planning, which is that ability to kind of plan and execute your day. So the fact that, you woke up this morning, you looked at your calendar and you said, oh, I have this presentation the Villages is sponsoring, and then, going about your daily tasks. And dementia means that somebody is having trouble in these areas, noticeable enough to interfere with daily life. But there's something causing those symptoms, that cognitive decline. And there's about 80-something types of diseases that can cause the symptoms of dementia, with Alzheimer's disease being the most common disease. And as you can see, here's that umbrella term. Another analogy that I've heard people use is dementia is like the word flower, and there's many different types of flowers. Roses might be the most common flower, maybe daisy's the next. So that's kind of the same type of categorization that we have. So vascular dementia is the second most common disease that causes the symptoms of dementia. And then you see here two others called Lewy body dementia and frontal temporal dementia. There is also something called mixed dementia, and that's just having two types of diseases that cause dementia. And in Western culture, that's often vascular and Alzheimer's combined, because we do have high rates of cardiovascular disease in Western culture. And then about 10% of the time, this last point here, about 10% of the time, we see people come into the clinic with something that looks like dementia, and it's not. It's a treatable medical condition, things like hypothyroidism, or maybe a brain tumor. And depression can look like dementia also, but those are treatable. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk to you today about these kind of 4 pillars of cognitive health, or how to age well. And the first one is physical health and exercise. Sorry, next slide, please. The first one we're going to talk about is physical health and exercise. Next slide. So we've already talked about what's heart healthy is brain healthy, right? So we know that we've known for years that getting out and doing aerobic exercise is good for our heart. It helps our heart, which is a muscle, it helps our heart stay strong, pump that blood throughout our body. So now we are transferring that also to what's heart healthy is brain healthy. So that physical activity is going to help our brains. And it's really important, if you don't do any kind of physical activity, if you can start today, these are some steps that you want to take to make yourself successful. And I know these may sound simple, but if you've ever tried to change a habit, it's not as easy as you think. Making people accept and make behavior changes is actually pretty difficult. So these are some tips for the physical health and physical activity. Do something you like. You'll hear in the cognitive piece that we want you to challenge yourself, maybe try new things. But when it comes to physical activity, really think about doing something you like, because it'll be easier to stick with it. Start out small. We always hear, in our careers as we were working, we want these stretch goals. But with physical activity and changing something, again, we want to start out small and manageable so that we can be successful. So don't, after today, say, well, I'm going to go out 7 days a week and I'm going to walk for an hour, if you don't do any kind of walking right now, because you probably won't be successful. So make it manageable, and then you can build. Once you have that success and you're feeling like you're doing well, then you can add on. Think about moving safely. Now, as we age, we don't always necessarily have the greatest balance sometimes, that we just need to make sure that we're really thinking about how we can move safely. If you choose to get out and ride on a bike, please wear a helmet. And just think about how the activity that you need to do can be safe for you. If you're feeling unbalanced, if you have trouble with balance, maybe you're doing some water walking or water jogging or water aerobics, because that water helps you with your balance. It is aerobic exercise that we need to do, that exercise that gets our heart rate up. So if you're out with a friend, think about, you want to be walking or doing that activity vigorously enough that it's kind of hard to have a conversation with that friend. And then speaking of friends, it's always super helpful to see if you can get a buddy system going, because that motivation can really get you out of the house or get you motivated to do the activity that you want to do. And then we always do recommend checking with your doctor before you start any type of physical activity regimen. It's always good to make sure that it's okay. And your doctor can also sometimes refer you to a physical therapist or somebody else that can maybe help you figure out what's best for you. Next slide, please. Here are a couple other things that we can do that are related to lifestyle choices around physical health. If it was really super easy to stop smoking, we could just go ahead and stop smoking. We know that it's hard to stop. So if you are smoking, please try to reduce with the goal of stop smoking. But we know that smoking damages the vasculature, the blood vessels throughout the body. And so if those blood vessels are damaged, the blood isn't going to get to your body and your brain as well as it used to. Avoiding excess alcohol. If there have been studies that show some moderate alcohol is protective for our heart and our brain, but if you're not drinking right now, we're not saying that you should start drinking, but we all know that if you have excess alcohol, you get poor sleep, your memory isn't so great, you feel a little foggy. So excess alcohol is something you want to avoid. You want to try to get the best sleep you can. You might have seen in the New York Times recently, there was a study about the number of hours of sleep. And I think it was 7 hours that people needed to get. And it can help with our brains and our physical health. Avoid head injury. I heard that there's a home safe event coming up. We know that even just one concussion can increase the risk of somebody developing dementia. So you want to make sure your home environment doesn't have cords that you can trip over or throw rugs that you can trip on. We also hear this a lot, this head injury with professional sports players, especially those football players who are getting Alzheimer's disease and another type of dementia called CTE because of those repeated concussions. We want to try to manage stress as well as we can. So making sure that you're getting physical activity, which is great at managing stress, or using other methods to manage your stress level. It's also important to think about treating depression. And in the past 13, 14 months with COVID, we know that a lot of people have been feeling more depressed. We've been away from our family and friends, not being able to see and do the things we're so used to doing. So if you're feeling depressed or sad, it's important to talk to your doctor about that. And then always good to visit your doctor on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Some other things to think about that are heart and brain healthy is making sure that your blood pressure is managed. And you're going to hear a little bit in a second about a study that was pretty amazing on blood pressure. You also want to make sure your blood sugars are maintained in a normal range. So we do know that folks with diabetes have a higher risk of developing forms of dementia, and that's maybe related to blood sugar changes. Weight, it's important to keep your weight in, again, a normal range. There are studies that weight gain in the midlife era can increase the risk of somebody developing dementia. And then cholesterol, also making sure that our cholesterol numbers are in the normal ranges, whether that's by changing diet or taking medication, but that again is related to heart health. Next slide.
Yeah, so Stefanie mentioned about blood pressure, all of those numbers. We're learning more and more about how they can help us to decrease our risks of developing dementia. And you'll hear us saying that over and over again, decreasing risks. And if you think back to those early slides that Stefanie put up about what we know about what's happening in the brain, it's what we don't know that's causing us to use the word risk reduction rather than prevention. And of course, now's the time that they are coming to cut my lawn. So I'm gonna just close that. Apologies for that. So I wanna tell you a little bit about the Sprint Mind study, because while all the information that, that Stefanie and I are gonna go through today is important, if there is one piece of it you take away today, it's remembering about the Sprint Mind study. This was the first time that they were able to demonstrate a reduction of new cases of cognitive impairment. So if you think of cognitive impairment on a continuum, we start out as cognitively unimpaired, and as impairment comes into our lives, not everybody becomes cognitively impaired, but if you are going to develop dementia or mild cognitive impairment, it happens over a continuum. So in the earliest part of that cognitive impairment is something called mild cognitive impairment. This is important to remember because if we can prevent new cases of mild cognitive impairment, we can prevent new cases of dementia. Everybody who develops dementia passes through mild cognitive impairment. Not everybody who has mild cognitive impairment goes on to develop dementia. It does increase our risks. So this study showed that we could see a reduction in new cases of cognitive impairment at both the MCI, mild cognitive impairment level, as well as dementia. This study looked at 9,000 people who were over the age of 50, who were at a higher dementia risk. So they had high blood pressure, they had potentially diabetes, they had all of those other cardiovascular risk factors that Stefanie just talked about. And there were two arms to this intervention. There was a standard arm, which kept the systolic level of blood pressure at 140. And then there was what was considered to be an intensive treatment, which was reducing that systolic to 120. What they found was that there was a dramatic reduction of small vessel disease on an MRI for people who were in the intensive treatment arm of the trial. We saw a 19% reduced risk of mild cognitive impairment, a 17% reduced risk of dementia. And when they looked at both of those together, because you remember, everybody who develops dementia passes through mild cognitive impairment. Not everybody who has mild cognitive impairment goes on to develop dementia. We see a little bit smaller, but 15% reduced risk. So what this is telling us today is everybody should be checking their blood pressure. Everybody should be managing their blood pressure, whether you're 40 or 90, because we can see here that by keeping our blood pressure at about 120 systolic is going to give us a potential reduced risk of developing mild cognitive impairment and dementia from anywhere from 15 to 19%. At the time before this study, the normal, what was considered to be normal blood pressure was 140 systolic. Today, it is 120. So Stefanie, I'll turn it back over to you to keep us moving forward.
So now we're going to talk about diet and nutrition, kind of the next pillar of brain and aging well, brain health and aging well. Next slide, please. So going back to, we know what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Again, we've talked so much about, and for the last 10, 20 years, about what's a heart healthy diet. You know, we've heard about that Mediterranean diet and the types of fats and nutrients that are good for our heart. Once again, with that heart-brain connection, that diet and nutrition is so important for our brain. Also, I mean, our brain it's that muscle, it's that organ, it needs energy also. And so if we're eating a good diet, it's getting the right type of energy to fuel itself so that it can continue to think well. And we do know, again, as I mentioned with cardiovascular disease, these dietary guidelines can reduce the risk of different types of cardiovascular diseases. It's also been shown to help with different types of cancer, Parkinson's disease, stroke, and diabetes. I mean, we know with diabetes that sometimes people can really manage their diabetes by changing the way they eat. And so this is also now a factor for brain health, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. Next slide, please. So these two columns here, these are kind of the pillars of the Mediterranean diet, the diet that is suggested for brain health. So eating, and there is a diet in the United States called the DASH diet, which is basically the Mediterranean diet, but with low sodium, because we do tend to have a lot of processed foods in the American diet, which are high in salt, which leads to or can contribute to high blood pressure, which we just heard is something we want to avoid. So the Mediterranean diet or the DASH diet are the kind of recommended diets, and they include eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, especially those really brightly colored fruits and vegetables, those blueberries and the kale. You know, we've all heard for the last 3 years, kale, it's the superfood. But these brightly colored fruits and vegetables are very healthy for us. It also includes eating a lot of nuts, beans, and whole grains. And you might think, well, nuts, they're high in fat. That's probably not good, especially for weight. But nuts have that healthy type of fat that our body and our brain needs. And if you think about a nut, one of the most brain healthy nuts is a walnut. And I love this because when you think about it, a walnut looks a lot like a brain. So that is a very brain healthy food to eat. And again, those whole grains, the whole wheat breads, not the processed, not overly processed breads. You want to think about those lean meats and poultry and those really fatty fishes, the salmon, the mackerel, the sardines. They have all those rich omega-3 fatty acids that are good for our brain. And in fact, those omega-3 fatty acids are actually kind of the insulation, the myelin sheath that goes around the neurons that are in our brain. And then vegetable oils are the kind of oils and fats that we want to make sure that we're using in our cooking and our eating. And these on the right are the foods that we want to avoid, those processed foods, those saturated fats, deep fried foods. But I do also, especially after 14 months of a pandemic where we haven't had a lot to celebrate, we also want to think about everything in moderation, right? Just like Julia Child said, there are times we want to make sure that we're celebrating things, especially because we haven't been able to celebrate with family and friends for the last 14 months. So, you know, if you're at a birthday party, because you can finally get together with family and friends, and there's that beautiful, rich chocolate cake, go for it. We just don't want you to eat it every single day. Nutritionists will also often say, if you're out in the stores, think about shopping the perimeter of a supermarket, because that's where those healthier foods are, the dairy, the fruits and vegetables, and the meats, and then kind of avoid the inside, the interior of the supermarket. Next slide, please. We get asked a lot about dietary supplements. And we do know that there are times when people do need to take supplements and vitamins. Work with your doctor on those. For me, I lived in Seattle for 15 years. And if you think about Seattle, we've always heard about the gray, terrible, rainy weather up in Seattle. And it is interesting that actually about 75% of the population in the Puget Sound area are vitamin D deficient. And that is because vitamin D is converted in our bodies because of sunlight. So I was vitamin D deficient after 15 years of living in Seattle. And so I did need to take vitamin supplements to get myself up into that level. But these are conversations you should be having with your doctor, because you're going to be hopefully seeing your doctor at least once a year, if not more. And a lot of these kind of supplements and vitamin deficiencies can be diagnosed with a simple blood test. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about cognitive activity. So the physical health and exercise, the diet and nutrition, those areas have the most research behind them for our brain health. Cognitive activity has some research, and we'll talk about how this research has looked at how it might help our brain health. Next slide, please. So keeping your mind active can form new connections around our brain cells. So, you know, the brain is an organ, but I also think of it as a muscle. It's just like your bicep. If your bicep muscle, if you're lifting weights with your bicep, if you're just always using the same 5 pounds, you're not stressing that muscle and making it bigger. But if you increase it to 10 pounds, you are now going to build more strength. Same with our brains, right? We can do all these great things. We can read our books every day, but if we start challenging our brains, we can build new pathways. We can build that muscle, that brain muscle, or what we call cognitive reserve. We also know that cognitive activity actually increases blood flow to our brain. There's a great PET scan that I've seen where somebody's actually saying a word and a part of their brain lights up because there's more blood going to that part of the brain. If they're just thinking about a word, a different part of the brain is lighting up because the blood flow is going to the brain. So again, it's much like our brain is much like a muscle. And when we start working it, the blood is going to be increasing. The blood flow is going to be increasing to those areas. So challenging our brain, doing mentally stimulating activities, it's going to help maintain and possibly improve our cognition, increase that cognitive reserve. And we know that engaging in formal education, lifelong learning, coming to lectures that the village is sponsoring on subjects that are new to you will help keep your brain healthy and will help provide some protection, lower that risk for developing dementia. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before, it's like that bicep muscle, you know, you can maintain it by always using that 5-pound weight, but if you increase that weight, you're going to increase the size of your bicep muscle. So that's the same thing we want to do with our brains. Read books that challenge you, read articles, challenge your brain a little with the things you do. Same thing with like puzzles or games. It's always good to try new ones because you need to learn, and you'll be creating new pathways by learning new things. Engage in new skills or hobbies. And again, as being a village member, you have those activities at your fingertips where you can try new things or engage in that ongoing learning with these interesting different lectures and workshops that the village offers to you. Next slide, please. Lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about social engagement. And this is the area that has probably I'm going to say the least amount of research behind it. And that sounds terrible because it's not like it doesn't have any. It has a lot of research around it, but it's not as studied as these other 3 areas. Although post-COVID or with COVID, I think we're going to see a lot more studies on what social engagement is doing for our physical and mental health after 14 months of COVID. Next slide, please. So being engaged with an active social life has been shown to associated with living longer, with, interestingly enough, fewer disabilities as folks age. And we know that staying engaged in your community can offer you an opportunity to maintain the skills. There's a phrase in neuroscience called use it or lose it. And when you think about it, it's true. If you stop doing something, you lose the ability to do it. And it takes a lot longer to get back into that. So you want to be able to use your skills, teach your skills to other people so you don't lose those skills. And this is, again, something that has been shown to possibly delay or reduce the risk of the onset of dementia. Next slide, please. So the things we want to do is make sure we're visiting with family and friends, those people that are important to us, those connections that we have. In COVID, that may have been by phone or video. We're coming out. We feel like we're coming out of COVID. And so hopefully you'll be able to get together with those people in person soon. Think about meeting others. And again, the village is like perfect for this. You have 3 different villages that have been combined into one. So I know that there are a couple people out on the coast. Well, you're meeting people you wouldn't normally have met before. So learn and engage with other people and meet new people. Stay involved with your community. Maybe even think about volunteering. I'm sure there's volunteer opportunities through the village. And volunteering gives you the ability to teach your skills to other people. And again, that's that use it or lose it phenomenon. You are teaching somebody something that you're good at. So you continue to use it and you're maintaining those pathways in your brain. And then think about joining different groups or clubs. And this is a great way to get into something that's different for you, because you'll have that social setting and social support. And so you just get to try something new with other people that are engaged and excited about that. Next slide, please. And then it's always great, and it's actually really pretty easy to put all 4 of these together. People often don't think about, you do one activity and you actually may be hitting multiple of these pillars. So in the past, when I've been out in the community doing this, we've always tried to brainstorm ways and activities that do more than one of these pillars, the strategies at the same time. And the best we've come up with is dancing. So dancing it's physical activity. It's social because you're with other people. And it's cognitive because not only do you need to know the movements of the dance, but you also have to be aware of other people on the dance floor. So it's pretty easy to combine or have one activity that hits multiple of these strategies. Next slide. And in honor of Cinco de Mayo today, because it is May 5th, we decided to show you how you can put all 4 of these pieces together. So we're coming out of a pandemic. Lots of folks have 1 vaccine, if not fully vaccinated with 2 shots. So you might be able to actually invite friends over and have a safe, COVID-safe gathering. And you can make a healthy guacamole dip and serve it with vegetables. And then you're eating healthy. You can play Mexican Loteria, which is like American Bingo or Mexican trained dominoes. And maybe if you are really motivated, you can learn a simple ballet folklorico, which is a Mexican dance. So you're being social, you're eating well, you're doing cognitive activity, and you're doing something physical. Next slide, please. Off to you, Claire.
So as Stefanie talked about in the very beginning, we know what may impact our risk. We know the things that we have some control over and some of the things that we don't. I'm just going to review them here for you. And what's really important is what happens when we look at all of these things together. So we just saw on the last slide the importance of maximum benefit. But what's the evidence behind that maximum benefit? Research is suggesting that combining multiple healthy factors may be the most impactful, and that includes all of those areas that Stefanie's taken some time to go over. And this is coming from some older scientific evidence that came out of Finland several years ago. This was a 2-year lifestyle intervention study that in Finland was taking place versus usual standard of care. So this was a 2-year multi-domain intervention of diet, exercise, cognitive training, and then adding in those vascular risk monitoring pieces that we talked about earlier, like why blood pressure is so important. The findings from this large long-term randomized controlled trial did suggest that a multi-domain intervention could improve or maintain cognitive function for at-risk older adults. So they looked at 1,260 participants over 2 years. They were randomized into either the usual care or into the lifestyle intervention range. And they were looking at people with an increased risk of cognitive decline. So those people like that would have been eligible for the Sprint Mind study. And the additional intervention was just regular advice. But we know excuse me, we know that Finland and the US are quite different. And so the Alzheimer's Association is embarking on a large-scale clinical trial today to study multi-domain lifestyle intervention and its impact on reducing risk for cognitive decline. The big question we have to answer is, what would happen if we add on an additional component to a lifestyle intervention, such as that approach to reducing risk for cognitive decline? This study will happen over 2 years in 5 sites across the United States. But we're going to do things a little bit differently here in the US. Instead of standard care as the second arm of the intervention, this study will have 2 arms. They'll have a structured lifestyle group that will focus on those 4 modalities, just like FINGER, including the monitoring of cardiovascular risk factors, exercise, diet, cognitive, and social stimulation. But we're also going to compare that to a self-guided group. So in this particular trial, both arms of the intervention get an intervention. In other clinical trials, if you think of sort of traditional clinical trials where they maybe give a medication to test whether it's effective, let's say on cholesterol, people either get the actual medication or they get what we call a placebo, right? A sugar pill or a fake pill that doesn't have any of the components in it that would actually help to reduce cholesterol. And so in that, they're doing what's called a blinded study, where they're looking at an intervention, the medication versus nothing. In this intervention, we're actually going to do something and something. One is just going to be a little bit more intense than the other. And so what's exciting about this is that the self-guided group will get the same information. They'll have a care navigator that meets with them, just not quite as regularly. They'll be given the information that we shared with you earlier. So it's good to know what foods to eat, what kind of cardiovascular exercise. Stefanie talked about increasing our heart rate. We call that a rate of exertion. So we teach people about what it means to really get your blood pumping, right? Your exercise on, and you're feeling a sweat, and you're really getting your heart rate up. They'll get all that information. They just will be told, here you go do it. And what we want to compare is whether or not there's the potential for benefits in both groups, or if one group has more success in really seeing a reduction of protecting our brain health through a reduction of risk, or risk reduction of dementia. So what's exciting about this is it's happening in not too far north of our backyard. Each of these 5 sites is partnering with a health system across the US. The Alzheimer's Association, our staff are highly involved in this intervention. And you can see here on the map, we've got a site in Northern California through UC Davis in the Sacramento area. So we're really excited because this is happening in our backyard. But what's also happening at the same time is what we're calling ancillary studies that are going to talk about some of those other risk factors that Stefanie talked about. We want to see that the impact of all of these other things like sleep and our gut health, what we call the microbiome, and how neurovascular, how our neurovascular system is impacted through the study as well. So the NIA, in addition to the Alzheimer's Association, has funded additional studies to look at the impact of all of these things. So in the neuroimaging study, they're going to use imaging like a PET scan to assess the changes in the brain as a result of these interventions. So they'll be relying on self-reported information and gathering information through other different pieces that we've set up as part of the intervention. They'll be able to compare that to a neuroimage like a PET scan to actually see whether or not there's changes in the brain. The Pointer Z study, as you can imagine, is going to focus on sleep. Stefanie talked about the importance of 7 hours of sleep. We've also seen some great studies come out that look at the risk of cognitive impairment for people who have things like sleep apnea. So if you have sleep apnea, you're at a higher risk of developing dementia. Again, a modifiable change. You can treat sleep apnea. So this will add in an in-home sleep measurement to examine the effects of the intervention on sleep disturbances that are linked to cognitive decline. The Pointer microbiome ancillary study will use fecal and blood samples to investigate the effect of diet and exercise on the association between the bacteria in our gut and Alzheimer's disease. And then Pointer Neurovascular will look at the effects of the interventions on blood vessel function. So they're going to really see, remember we talked about that 25% of our blood from our heart going to our brain. They're going to be able to look at those blood vessels, the functioning of those blood vessels, to see how these are linked to changes in cognition. The Alzheimer's Association here in the United States is funding US Pointer based on the study from Finland, and we are not alone. Through this amazing work, we are starting to see an international network really coming up to say, what can we be doing today to decrease our risks of dementia and prevention of cognitive impairment? And so you can see here through something called the Worldwide Fingers Initiative, countries across the world are joining together to plan or implement a finger-like study. And what's really important is it's got to work for that country, for that culture. What works here in the US probably would not work in Finland. Just the day-to-day life, the standard of care can be enough to be different, that we need to think about modifying these interventions to fit the culture and the country that we're trying to see the impact on. So this is really exciting to be part of something that's going to be really first of the kind in the world. And it's important because at any given moment, research, learning, discoveries are happening. This is an exciting time to think about Alzheimer's and dementia research. And I want to share with you just a couple of ways that we're changing the game when it comes to accelerating the speed of research. Biomarker technologies are really doing that for us in the field. These are tools that will change our experience in the physician's office in many ways in the future, but they're already a critical part of how we conduct clinical research studies today. And they're changing the research and clinical landscape. So you might not know exactly what I mean by a biomarker, but you're probably familiar with the concept. So a biomarker is that biological marker in us that shows evidence of a disease. So if you've ever taken a cholesterol test or a blood sugar test, you get blood drawn, and what they find, what they can extrapolate from that blood sample is what we call a biomarker. It's that biomarker for that heart disease risk or for diabetes, respectively. It's simply something you can measure in the body that tells you something about a disease process. So if you think about back to when Alzheimer's was first discovered back in 1906, we didn't have the luxury of knowing about these types of biomarkers. And what we're seeing is that they are changing the way today we think about research. So 10 years ago, someone was to participate in a clinical trial for a drug that was targeting, let's say, the amyloid in the brain, one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. That person was enrolled in a trial using the typical ways that we diagnose for Alzheimer's today, using a history and cognition exam from your physician. They would do tests like MRIs or CAT scans to rule out other things that are happening. They would do blood tests, but what they're looking for is infections or changes, that other things that could be causing the cognitive decline. And from that, you're determined whether or not you have the probable signs of Alzheimer's or dementia. Well, we know that not everybody that goes through those clinical testings today necessarily do have the clinical biomarker or the clinical biological changes of Alzheimer's disease. Oftentimes we get it right, but every now and then there are people that are diagnosed with a type of dementia or diagnosed with Alzheimer's that don't actually have those biological changes in the brain. And so what these biomarkers are allowing us to do is enroll people in clinical trials who are actually have that biological marker to say, if I'm going to receive that target, I'm getting the right target for the right thing that's going wrong with me. And we can do that in clinical settings right now for research only, using things like PET scans, so a positron emissions tomography test where it can show what's working and not working in the brain. We've even sophisticated blood tests already to be used in a clinical setting. And while they're not ready for our doctor's office today, they are really close to being something that you could do probably within the next 3 to 5 years, where you could go to your physician to get a blood test to see if you have that biological marker for Alzheimer's disease. There's other emerging markers like retinal scans and cerebral spinal fluid that are used, that are the cerebral spinal fluid is certainly something that's way more invasive than the blood test. And of course, the PET scan is just as accurate, but way more expensive than a blood test. So you can see how this is really starting to think about ways that we can accelerate the speed of research, but at the same time, helping us to modernize the diagnosis. Because we know today that if someone my age, just on the cusp of turning 50, is going to develop Alzheimer's or in my late 60s or 70s, those changes in my brain are happening already. So imagine when we have an intervention that could actually stop those symptoms before they stop the progression of the disease before the symptoms appear. We need a way to be able to test for that. And so biomarkers are going to help us get there, but they're also going to help us find a more accurate and timely way to diagnose once those symptoms do appear, so that we can give the current interventions that are available until that time. So we're not quite there yet, but we are talking about a way where we go from this history and cognition, this probable Alzheimer's disease, to an actual biomarker that says definitively that someone has the hallmarks of the disease or not. And it's really an exciting change that's really happened in the last 5 to 10 years and is only going to sort of improve things moving forward. We're also seeing how things like PET scans are being used in studies as a way to support their use moving forward. So there was a huge study that came out a couple of years ago called the IDEAS study that was funded by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Service, because they want to answer the same question about whether or not we can use these costly tests in a way to actually save money in the long run. We know that about 50% of people living with Alzheimer's and dementia have never formally been diagnosed, and we need to change that. We need people to go and get a test and have access to a test when they see these symptoms of the disease. And so CMS, along with the Alzheimer's Association, initiated a study called the IDEAS trial that looked at whether or not the use of amyloid PET scans could improve care management and would have a major improvement on cost and medical outcomes. And so 2/3 of participants had a change in their diagnosis or their care management plan as a result of their PET scan. So if you remember when I mentioned earlier that when we go by histories and physicals, when we go by nothing but probable, we're going to potentially see some mistakes. And PET scans were used in these circumstances with really challenging cases that weren't clear. And physicians today are probably diagnosing at about a 90 to 95% accurate rate. But if you're in that 5% that's not, this is where the IDEAS study was able to pay for a PET scan to help answer those questions. We also knew that about 65% of people reported that they had an improved care management plan, right? They made different changes. They made changes to their long-term care planning, to their to getting involved in creating a plan of care as a result of having an accurate diagnosis. And what we want to be able to do is continue this study to continue to see if these can help doctors in diagnosis and treating memory. So we're launching on the IDEAS study 2.0, otherwise known as New Ideas. And we're really going to be able to increase the number of participants in diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, as well as people who are younger than 65, who were originally not in the first study because, of course, it was a CMS Medicare Medicaid study. I'm going to keep moving a little quickly here because I see us close to running out of time. I mentioned about COVID. What we're learning about COVID-19 and cognition in people living with dementia is that while people living with dementia aren't necessarily, it's not dementia that's, it's not the Alzheimer's itself that puts them at an increased risk, but certainly it's the people with Alzheimer's or dementia may not follow all of the health recommendations, like washing hands regularly, like, remembering to wear the PPE, like our masks. So while it's not the Alzheimer's specifically that might be putting people at increased risk of developing COVID-19 if you have cognition, but potentially the impact of the cognitive changes that may not allow us to do all the right things that you and I know how to do. But we also know that there are some changes in the brain that's happening with COVID-19. So for those that don't have Alzheimer's or dementia, what's the impact of COVID-19 on the brain? And so there is sort of this global healthcare need to study this. And so the Alzheimer's Association has joined with the World Health Organization and 25 other organizations to kind of investigate the long-term impact of exposure of the novel coronavirus on the brain, including cognition, behavior, and function. This is in the very early stages of its study, but an important study to look at, because we've never seen this before, so we don't really know what kind of impact it's having on the brain. And just to kind of give you an idea of what's in the clinical landscape, we currently have many phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials going on, 180 phase 2. Those are your smaller trials that are in human study that are looking at dosing, usually looking at safety, looking at some other components. Phase 3 is when those trials really expand to a larger trial population. A good clinical trial should have 2,000 plus people in it. So if you see, one of the slides Stefanie talked about was the supplements, and you hear, this is the greatest new thing that's going to stop Alzheimer's. Most of those supplements have not been studied in an FDA clinical trial, the rigors of a clinical trial, so they don't actually have any evidence behind them. Those that are claiming that they do, look at the small print, find out how many people were in the trial. Sometimes you'll see things as low as 10 people. So when you're thinking of something like US Pointer, we're going to have 2,000 people in that study. There's a big difference between the effectiveness of a treatment on 10 people versus 2,000. And some of these are looking at different effects of cognition, but also clinical trials that are looking on the behavioral and psychological impacts of the disease. We need to think about changing the trajectory of the disease. If we can delay the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years, as many people almost as have it today would not develop it by 2050. If we can think of a way to either delay the onset, to slow that progression, stop that progression, we have a huge opportunity here to change the trajectory. And I know we covered a lot of information. If you're a science, if science interests you, please download our Science Hub. And I'm just going to go through to the resources page, Stefanie, and sort of turn it back over to you, Devorah, to think about if we have any questions. I know we've kind of taken way more time than we were supposed to.
Well, this was really interesting. And if we didn't get through all the slides, then I'm happy to send something to the participants afterwards.
Yeah, the only slide we didn't get through was just the trial match slide, which talks about if you're interested in learning how to participate in a clinical trial. But if you go on to alz.org, you can find that.
Great. Wow. Well, it's great to know that there's so much research going on and that there's already so many good findings from what you guys have been, what's going on in the field right now. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. This morning in the news, it talked about that when the COVID is gone, that there's this brain disease that's occurring to many people, and they don't know what it is and what to do with it. Are you working on anything like that? I mean,
Yes.
Alzheimer.
Yeah, so I think that's one of those things that they're looking at in that worldwide study that I talked to you about with the World Health Organization. I think there's a real need for us to be looking at what the long-term effects of COVID are on the brain. I don't think we have any answers yet. I think these are all the questions that we're starting to see, those sort of ramifications of something. The whole thing with COVID, of course, is that we don't know. We've never seen this before. It's why science has changed us. So I think I think there'll be more to come in the coming weeks and months and years as we start to learn more. And it will be part of that greater study. So if you go on to alz.org, there's a whole page that talks about the coronavirus.
Okay, thank you. Great lecture. That's good. And Predigen doesn't work, right?
Pardon?
There's all these ads about people taking Predigen.
Yeah, so
It
that's,
doesn't work, right?
it's never been studied. So there's no science behind it. So that's one of those supplements that I will say we had a big win in 2019, early 2020, where the FDA really took a stance against claims that you can improve cognition when you have no evidence to show it. And if you ever see those Prevagen commercials or any of those supplements, if you now look at the very, very bottom of your screen, it's probably about this big, there's actually a statement that they're required by law to put up from the FDA. Of course, you can't read it, but it's just good to know that it's there. And the FDA put out a letter sort of asking them to cease and desist, claiming that they can improve cognition because there's zero evidence behind it.
That's why I'm not buying it.
Yeah, you can tell I get a little passionate about the supplements. Believe me, if there was something that worked that quickly and that well, the Alzheimer's Association would be shouting it from the rooftops.
Yeah.
Question.
Go ahead.
I have a lot of forgetting at the age of 88, almost 89. To what extent is that normal? And I have underheard that if you know that you're forgetting things, you don't have dementia. Is that true?
Stefanie, why don't you take that one?
So we do have changes to the way we think and remember things that are part of normal aging. The important thing to think about is, sorry, the cat she just really wanted to be part of this. If it's interfering with your daily life, and it's usually more than one area, not just memory. So also like not being able to do your daily tasks or so it's not just usually one thing that has to change for it to be a form of dementia. And it does need to be interfering with daily life. So some changes happen and that's normal. And then sadly, I've already forgotten the second part of your question. See, it's part of normal.
There we go. Well, what I find is that I have my hand-eye coordination is changing. I wonder if that's the same sort of thing. I knock a lot of things on the floor.
There are changes to the way people process visually. So, it is always a really cool thing that you can ask for if you're on Medicare is an annual wellness exam from your physician, and they can do a baseline cognitive test. And that's just to give you that baseline. So that might be something for everyone to think about, is asking your physician for the annual wellness exam and just see where you are. And then that can be tracked over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I had a friend who used to work with Alzheimer's patients at the Veterans Hospital, and his comment was, if you forget where you put your keys, that's normal. But if you have your keys in your hand and you don't know what to do with them, that's when you should be concerned.
Stefanie, I think you were talking about the umbrella of dementia. I wasn't familiar with some of the ones you had mentioned, like the Lewy body and just the differences of some of those. Could you explain a little bit further of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 80 something types of diseases that cause those symptoms of dementia. Lewy body dementia is an interesting one, and folks might be familiar with it because of Robin Williams and that new documentary on Robin Williams is amazing. That just came out about his Lewy body. He was actually diagnosed with Parkinson's disease before his death because physically Lewy body disease dementia looks like Parkinson's with the kind of the shakiness and the unsteady gait. But Lewy body dementia doesn't always have that short-term memory component that we see as one of the first signs with Alzheimer's. It is more changes in like really rapid changes in cognition. So throughout the day, somebody can be confused and about a couple hours later, they seem fine and then confused again. Also, hallucinations are quite common with Lewy body dementia. And a lot of times those folks that have Lewy body and they're having hallucinations know it. They recognize that those hallucinations aren't really part of life. I have a client and they have Lewy body dementia in the early stage and they see a person. And we were in a support group and she said, there's a lizard over there on the chair. And I looked at her and I said, you're hallucinating, right? Because she's very aware. And she said, no, my hallucination moved. She was sitting on it and now there's a lizard. And somebody had left a lizard toy in the conference room and she hadn't seen the lizard toy because her hallucination had been actually sitting on it for a while. So she's not disturbed by having that hallucination. So Lewy body is just a different kind of animal for dementia. Frontal temporal dementia is also another one that was under that umbrella. It affects the frontal and temporal lobes. So the frontal lobe is right behind our forehead. And that's where a lot of impulse control, emotional regulation aspects of our personality are. So with frontal temporal dementia, again, a lot of times we don't see that short-term memory loss as the first sign, but we see changes in personality. We see folks gaining a lot of weight in a quick period of time because they don't have the impulse control. They don't stop eating. They might get arrested for shoplifting because they see something they want and they take it and leave the store. So that's, again, that impulse control and judgment. And often, actually, we see frontal temporal in more often than women, and actually often in younger men. So a lot of times I've worked with wives whose spouses have frontal temporal, and they say, well, this is not the man I married. His personality is 180 degrees different. So there are many, many different types of dementia. But those are vascular, Alzheimer's, sorry, the cattail, Alzheimer's, frontal temporal, and Lewy body are probably the four most common that we hear about.
Okay. Any other questions? Victoria, you look like you're moving towards the screen.
I know, I'm still trying to get acquainted with this. The new machine. I just wanted to point out, both of you have done a beautiful job and a beautiful balance of information for all of us to take in, and I thank you for that. And I was just particularly interested in the biomarkers, considering that we're all living so much longer and healthier, and to think that to be older and healthier, but our mind is not functioning, is terribly frightening for so many people. So I'm delighted to know that there is more research being done, and it's something I would like to hear more about as it comes along, at least to give some of us the feeling that we can be rescued at some point for not going over the cliff, that, as you well understand. But thank you, Claire, for that, and Stefanie for your excellent information going forward.
Thanks.
Yeah.
People ask me what I'm most excited about with Alzheimer's and dementia research, and right now it is biomarkers. I think it really is the answer to getting us to those next steps. And it is really exciting to see how far they've come in just a few years. I've learned more about how you have to store and spin and keep blood, and that's why it's not available today in a doctor's office, because you have to set up all of those parameters before you can have an effective blood test. But it is really exciting.
Great. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think I'll close out the Zoom, but I really want to thank you for this informative hour. I feel bad I did not ask everybody if it was okay, but I did tape this, so we have it recorded. There's objections, you can tell me. We won't put it up to YouTube, but we'd like to share it with those who were not able to come today. And if anybody wants to watch it again. I'll be putting that up there. And if you guys have other things that you want to share with the participants, please let me know and I'll send it out. Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Vaughn,
Thank
that
you.
the last slide they
Thank you.
What,
appreciate.
John?
Yeah, the last slide they showed with different websites and stuff, could that information be sent out?
Yeah, so I can, there's 2 resource slides. We can make those individual files for you, Deborah.
Yeah,
And
great.
I'm also going to send you the PDF version of the workbook so that everybody can have that to kind of keep their information and keep it in hand. It helps you to kind of track some of those healthy habits.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a healthy rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks. Now, how do I get out?
I'll end it so you don't need to worry.